It's calling 911. Where's your emergency?
I need an emergency. Right now, the shooting at the corner store next to CVS.
Okay, do you know if anyone's been hit?
Close hit. Get an ambulance here. Now.
We are. Who was hit?
Some young man.
So
he's bleeding to death. Somebody just shot this kid 3 times.
Okay, we got everyone en route to him right now.
This guy's dying. I'm not
Okay.
kidding you. The guy is dying.
The corner store is a tobacco product store situated near the end of a strip mall. When I arrived, I observed officers treating the victim, and it was clear that he had been shot multiple times in the chest.
He appeared to be a young male, early 20s. He was in the back of the store. There's a small parking lot, kind of a little bit of a darker area. Everything appeared that it happened right at that location. There weren't any blood marks or blood splatter anywhere else.
There were no shell casings recovered at the scene, which told us that it was likely that the weapon used was a revolver.
The victim had no weapons that we could see. So to us, it kind of looks like this might have been a one-sided type thing.
The victim was eventually identified by his identification being found in his wallet as Joseph Edward Ross. He was eventually transported to the hospital where he passed.
Joseph Ross was my firstborn. He had just turned 26. He was a big-hearted, loving young man. He would give the shirt off his back in a snowstorm to somebody else that needed it.
He was just always wanted to give to others and make sure that other people were okay.
He was a very talented musician, very, very talented.
He always had a guitar, he always had a harmonica. He played around on the drums, so he was very multi-talented.
That was his gift to everyone, really, was music.
He was making plans for his future. He was wanting to go to school, go to college, and he wanted to go into journalism because he was a good writer.
He was someone who made every day count for sure.
Our crime scene comes, takes photographs, really documents what's going on. Because there is a lot of activity, crowds start developing. So we start going up to those crowds. Hey, did you see what happened? Did you hear what happened?
The witness at the scene observed the victim walking through the parking lot, talking on a phone, and arguing. And shortly thereafter, they observed a red Dodge pickup truck pull into the parking lot.
And then I'd say 6 gunshots rang out.
You said you saw the driver of the truck.
Yes, sir.
How would you describe him?
He was a black male. They had pulled by, I really didn't get a good look at his face, but they were...
You say they. Was there one person?
Yeah, there was 2 people in the truck.
Could you tell what the other guy looked like?
No, because I just saw basically his silhouette.
The next procedure is we're gonna look around for surveillance cameras. We did see that there was a camera inside the corner store. We were able to see our victim come into the store, purchase a couple items, and walk out.
But the corner store did not have cameras that were functioning on the outside of the store itself. At that point in the investigation, it's a whodunit. We have a vehicle description, a description of one of the occupants of the vehicle, but no clear indications as to who they are. We just didn't know. Do you have any idea why we might be here? Okay, your brother Joe was shot and killed around the corner, over at the corner store.
He was shot?
Yes. We're trying to find out what happened to him. Do you know anybody that drives a red Dodge pickup truck?
Well, my friend Nate does.
Who's Nick?
It's just someone that I met through a friend.
What does he look like? Is he white or black?
He's white.
Okay.
And he always hangs out with a black dude.
Do you know the black male's name?
I think it's Gerald.
What else do you know about Nick?
He normally carries a 38 or a 9mm.
Has he ever gotten into it with your brother before?
They argue about a lot of stupid stuff. Nick's really, he seems like he's crazy. I wouldn't really want to mess with him.
Jonathan Ross said Nicholas Naring was 23 years old, a small-time drug dealer who was out of work.
He's the only friend that my kids have ever brought home that made me uncomfortable in my own home.
Certainly with it being all the links with the red Dodge pickup truck, the history between the two of them, the subject being armed on a regular basis, that obviously then at that point propelled Nicholas Naring to being the suspect that we were looking for.
The vehicle started pulling down, and we had officers basically just kind of surround it.
We identified Nicholas Naring as the passenger in the vehicle, as well as the driver, Gerald Lovelace, who was 25 years old. And they were both taken down and arrested. Inside the truck, we found a number of long guns, AR-15s, M14 shotguns. We found a revolver on Mr. Naring.
But what was also striking was Naring wasn't overly nervous, just like an everyday, no big deal type thing. Looking at the totality of everything, we knew that Naring was the main suspect.
We felt that Mr. Lovelace was likely to be the driver of the vehicle. So if we could flip Mr. Lovelace and get him to tell us something that implicated Mr. Naring, then our chances of success were greatly increased.
Having a confession would solidify the case and can paint the entire picture to the jury. But you may have just one shot at the suspect.
You went Gerald, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah,
doing good. I'm Detective Hornet. This is Detective Parsons. Okay. All right, Gerald, do you have any idea what this is about?
No, sir.
Okay. Gerald, we are doing an investigation into something that's going on that happened tonight. And I'd like to talk to you about it. How do you know the guy that you were in the car with?
Nick, I know Nick through school.
How close are you guys?
We're friends with him, not that close.
When you were pulled over, did you have any guns on you?
No, sir, I did not. I don't even own a gun.
Okay. Did somebody have guns on them?
I really don't know.
Gerald. The answer is no, you didn't. And then, yes, he did. And you knew that. And you lied. I asked you some of these questions because I know what some of the answers are going to be. Something happened tonight involving guns that, I don't think that was your fault. However, you were there. He was there. I think I have a pretty good grasp by doing the math as to what happened. But the problem is that if you're going to be on team I don't know with him, then you're going to hold some of the responsibility about what happened. Your biggest priority should be to yourself. But you're not being honest.
So he's got to choose one or the other, either be on our team or his team, with our help or against our help. This is the point where in his head he's negotiating that and he's working out what's his best interest.
If you're going to be dishonest, that means you're trying to help him. But you better start telling me what happened, otherwise you're going to have this come down, hit you in the head like a ton of bricks. If you lie, there's no one that can help you. And you give him every basis to put this on you. So, how about you tell me what happened? Gerald, don't piss away your life
Yes, sir.
for somebody else.
Yes, sir.
Okay?
I don't even know what's going on, man.
Yeah, you do, because you were there. And let me honestly tell you my position here. Okay?
Yes, sir.
You're either a murderer or you're someone who helped a murderer. Which would you rather be? You don't get that choice.
What I'm doing is I'm establishing an A and a B, eliminating any other options. It helps with establishing control and dominance in the interview.
And you give him every basic. You're there. Now you've explained to me how.
I just only didn't trust him. I didn't do, man.
Then stop it. Be honest. How about I stop talking to you and I go let him tell me what happened? He can either be very forthright or he can lie. Maybe he'll lie better than you. Because you're a horrible liar.
His eyes were down. He was scared. He looked defeated, like he had to give us something.
What happened on 9th Avenue? Did you shoot that guy?
No.
Who did? Who shot him?
I didn't shoot him.
Who shot him? You were in the truck. Harold.
Shoot him, man.
He says several times very firmly, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, which leaves open that he knows who did. So it's being persistent with it and continue with the question that he's not answering.
Who shot him?
They don't know.
Huh? What's that?
He did. I didn't.
Who's he? What's his name? Cheryl. I'm not, this isn't something where you need to play games with me. What's his name?
Ned.
The guy that was in the truck with you?
Yes, sir. I mean, I didn't know what was going on when we got there. I didn't know this was going on until he lifted his jacket up and shots came out.
So it was right from the get-go?
Yeah.
Before we entered the room to interview Nick, he was sleeping.
This is referred to as the perp nap. Someone who's typically guilty will actually fall asleep in the interrogation room because they're so exhausted from the stress associated with waiting to be arrested.
Nick, right? Yes, sir. Doing well. I'm Detective Barnett. This is Detective Parsons.
I'm gonna fall asleep.
That happens. It's okay. Do you have any idea what this is about?
No, I don't know. It's gunpoint, got on the car, got out of the car.
Yeah, but you know what? Anything that you have an idea what led up to that?
No.
Now, when you were stopped, you had a couple of guns on you?
Mm-hmm. I was going to go to shooting range. I just turned the corner, and the lights went on.
Okay. Well, while we're here, we're investigating something that happened earlier tonight. And we're wondering if you could tell us what happened tonight with you.
Right, midnight. I was at home for the longest time.
Is there any reason that your truck would have been at the CVS around the corner tonight?
No. It should have been.
Then how was it there?
I don't know.
The reason that it was there is because something happened there. Okay?
He's very engaged right now. He's up at the table, he's close in, he's in a very strong position. And at first, I'm back, so I move in to show that I also have a very firm position in my assertion that his vehicle's there. If it seems as though I'm not sure, he'll take that and he'll run with it. And that allows him to have an escape.
You had 3 guns on you tonight.
Yeah, one person, yeah.
You fire any of them tonight?
No.
Okay. Well, let's just say, for example, that maybe it's not one of the 3 that you had on you. It doesn't alleviate the fact that you were there when shots are fired.
No way.
You were involved in something tonight at that location. And I'd like to hear your side of what happened there.
When he's feeling threatened, he starts to back up. And the hand that he's able to actually goes into his pocket. So it's another defense mechanism that he's using where he's hiding and concealing what actually happened.
You can choose to be deceptive all you want, okay?
I have no reason to be on this side of town.
Let me point something out to you. This thing is that you were there because people wrote down the tag number of your truck there, okay?
No, the truck shouldn't have been there. Wasn't in my possession.
It was there.
Wasn't in my possession, though.
But you were there.
I wasn't there.
Yeah, you were.
How do you know that?
Video cameras.
Did you see me in my vehicle?
You're kind of distinct.
So I'm guessing that thing had full video around the whole camera? Around the whole store?
I'm not telling you there's video everywhere, because there's not.
At that point, I didn't have video of this shooting, but he's nodding because now he believes it. So with him, I felt comfortable throwing out the bluff in such a way because I didn't think he was going to call me on it, and I thought he would accept it.
I've heard no bullshit. What's that?
You want no bullshit?
No bullshit.
Alright. He comes up, he's grabbing his pants, pulling, like he's pulling something out. I popped his ass.
He's admitted to pulling the trigger. I am now in the game.
Stand up for me and show me what he did that got you upset.
He saw, like,
What was he wearing?
like pants and a shirt. The way I felt was it was him or me. I mean, I thought he was reaching for something because I felt threatened.
We know we are now in the room with the murderer. Now we have to attack his explanation as to why he felt justified in it.
Did you ever see a weapon?
No, but he was reaching. He put his phone in his pocket and he went like this. That's all I remember. It happened quick, okay?
And so what did you do?
I was like, oh, shit. Boom, 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 and he fell down like boom.
Understand this. I hear you talking about him reaching in his waistband. Okay? What I'm saying is that in the video I can see his hand. The entire time I can see his hand. I don't see it going into his waistband.
If you're going to bluff, it's got to be very calculated and careful. But he grasped onto the concept that there was videotape, and he was paranoid about that and accepted that I had seen that video footage.
I watched him.
That explains why it
comes right in my ass.
Does lying help you?
Lying will do me shit.
Stop it. Why did you do what you did?
But the truth.
Yes.
Motherfucker's a okay? That's straight up honesty. Motherfucker's a okay? He deserved it. He reached for at nothing. Shot the motherfucker's face. He made a noise. I shot him. No mine. That's it.
His true face comes out, and it comes out in grand fashion.
We were speechless. He just didn't care. It was pure evil.
They're like, damn consequences, we need to do this.
Yeah, you right. I up because I used my truck and the camera.
From the very beginning of this investigation, it was a whodunit. And within hours, we had the suspect in custody, we had a confession, we had him charged, and he was on his way to jail. Nick Nearing was sentenced to life in prison. That confession showed that he planned to kill Joseph from the very beginning. And it showed his mindset that he did not care.
The decision was made not to charge Mr. Lovelace with accessory to the murder because we actually believed his story that he wasn't prepared for what had happened. And he was much more valuable as a witness. He served a purpose in putting Mr. Nearing away.
There's no chance of Nick getting out ever. He'll die in prison, and that's probably best because I do believe that he would kill again if he had the chance.
I think it was important for all of us. We're his family. We need justice.
It breaks my heart. How could you destroy somebody that meant so much to so many people?
It alters your reality. It's totally shattering.
It has destroyed our family.
Joe had so much to offer. He was robbed of his life, and I know that he could have done so much more. He was just one of a kind.
I show up home from work that evening, and I park my truck in the driveway. My son come out of the house, and he's like, something happened to Natalia at the school. She fell, she hit her head, she's crying. I drove over there. When I got there, my daughter's crying, loud, a lot of pain. She couldn't move her legs, neither one. She keeps saying over and over, I can't feel my legs. And I keep asking to her, what happened? She looked at me like she was like lost. She's like, I don't know what happened.
I'm like, how did I get here? Like, what's going on? I was like, I don't remember anything. Everything's blank.
The principal started telling me that she was walking towards the school crying, and one of the kids saw her stumbling side by side. So they went there and helped her out. They opened the door for her to come in.
And my friend told me, you look like a zombie. You know, you were just like slow walking. Like, this is the type of stuff like you see in movies. And like, you don't remember? I'm like, yeah, I don't remember what's going on. I was like, what is this?
That was like a nightmare for us. Probably the scariest thing I ever lived. I was getting nervous. She didn't know what time it was. She didn't know what date it was. It's hard to remember that. Every time I talk, it hurt.
Her family said she lived in that neighborhood close by, less than a block and a half away.
We asked what happened, but she was in such distraught that we couldn't get much answers out of her.
I was like, direct right away, and I'm like, I think she got hit. Her clothes was dirty, kind of a little bit greenish and mud. She has like a dry leaf in her hair, and she can't move her legs. The officer looked at me like, that's what we think too.
The medics arrived there. Then she was transported to the hospital after that.
In the ambulance, I was scared. I thought, like, what if I can't move my legs anymore? What if I'm gonna be stuck in a wheelchair then my entire life?
I was just praying God that she can be able to walk again.
It was very clear that this girl was on the sidewalk and that a car left the roadway and struck her.
We had tire track marks, impressions. A motor vehicle had went up and over the curb, straddled the sidewalk, and then eventually came back down on the traveled portion of the road.
What we didn't know is why that car left the road. We thought that the driver could have been just very intoxicated and lost control of their car. It's quite common for people to leave the scene of an accident, even if someone's hurt.
We just started a canvass of the neighborhood, essentially looking for any witnesses. But at that time of day, there was nobody at home.
I'm just a girl just walking to a basketball game, and I didn't deserve this.
She asked, hey, come forward. We want to know who did it and why did it.
I felt like I got punched in the stomach at that point. I couldn't believe that this had happened anywhere, much less in our community. We wanted to let the family know that our police department would do whatever we could to help bring the person that had hurt their daughter to justice.
I think about my own kids being in that situation, and it's like, you know what? I'm gonna fight for justice for you. I'm gonna do everything I possibly can.
By the third day, it started getting a bit better. I was able to like sit up straight.
They did all the tests they can do to her body to look any broken bones, any internal bleeding. They couldn't find nothing.
It's just some bruising and swelling, but after that, I would be okay.
She is blessed to be alive. I told her, you have an angel to watch you.
It was a bit still foggy, but I was slowly starting to get a little bit new memories. I remember just like walking, and I see a black Jeep. And I saw like just a woman, and she was wearing a black coat with like some like fur on the hood. From there, I just remember just like getting conscious at the school at Indian Hills.
We were just trying to get the public's involvement. It was probably our biggest hope to gain more information.
We learned Nicole Poole was 42 years old. She lived in the Des Moines metro area.
In the still photo, she was at the front door knocking on the door, but we didn't have any video after that.
According to talking to her ex-husband, she was there to see her daughter.
The time of her being in the area was right. We had to find this Nikki Poole, and we needed to get her in for an interview.
We had found out several days later that she was in the Polk County Jail.
Nikki Poole had gone to a convenience store in West Des Moines. She was clearly either under the influence or having some sort of mental health episode at the time.
Go stand outside. Let's go stand outside.
Go!
Ma'am, let's come outside. Did you not hear me the 7 other times I told you?
Smoke, start pumping gas.
Stand over here.
She was in there throwing racial epithets out against the person that worked in the store.
Stand in front of the car.
Okay.
She also threw an object at the cashier there.
She was ultimately arrested for trespassing, harassment.
Natalia thought the vehicle that ran over her, it was a dark-colored Jeep, and she thought it was a female driving the vehicle.
I authored a search warrant to search that vehicle. It looked like there was a shoe print mark on the passenger side door.
And the dirt that was on the car, it looked like impressions from clothing. Like that pattern had been impressed into the side of the car. That really started to bring Nicole into the picture as the suspect.
I figured Nicole Poole would not answer any of our questions. I figured she'd just sit there and say, no, I want an attorney. So we went in there with a more relaxed approach.
So I know you were there getting gas. All that. What happened? What did you do before that? Remember? Yeah, what were you driving? What color was that? Black.
She seemed nervous. She seemed very timid and just quiet-like. She kept her legs crossed the whole time, so kind of semi-standoffish. We were, afraid if she would lock up on us.
I figured she wasn't going to talk with me at all.
Take some deep breaths, okay? How long have you had the Jeep?
Couple months.
Couple months, okay.
I was just trying to keep it, simple and basic. I didn't want to push her too much, just kind of soft approach with her. I wanted to try to make her feel comfortable and that she could tell me anything at that time.
The detective needs to create a level of comfort and help the person to understand that they are someone that's not going to get angry or judge them.
Do you remember we were wearing a coat that day? A coat?
There's a coat on it.
The coat does. Do you remember what you did at like noon that day? And I know it's been a couple weeks.
I was at home.
Where else did you go?
On my place.
Okay. Where is your daughter?
Over there.
Okay. Where's that at?
A5.
Fine. Did you go to the house or what?
I've been to the house, yeah.
Okay. What did you do there?
I got from the lake.
Okay.
They didn't answer.
Okay. So what did you do next?
I left.
Okay.
Someone walked. Yeah, I ran over her.
You ran over her on accident?
I was just in awe. I kind of had to pause there for a second and try to get my composure.
Oh my gosh, she just admitted she ran somebody over.
I kind of just want to try to get to the bottom of it. Why did she do this? Why did she say this?
Why didn't you stop? You don't know?
But I'm thinking, okay, the train's rolling, keep on going with this. But just keep it kind of low, don't get excited.
It's very important to take your own emotions out of it. Someone's not going to confess to you if they feel like you're going to have a reaction, you're going to be disgusted with what they say.
Are we the first folks you told? Okay. We really appreciate you coming forward with this, and I'm hoping that you feel better about this, okay? It's good to get this out, and we don't want to carry these burdens forever, right? That's good. That's very good. I'm hoping it's a little closure on your part, too.
When you show you care and you listen to individuals that you're interviewing, they're more apt to open up and talk to you because you know what? Now they have somebody that's going to listen to them.
You remember what she looked like?
Before she was Mexican, she got him.
Did you know that she was Mexican when you were approaching her?
Yeah, when we saw her face, I did.
Why didn't you stop? I'm just asking.
I was having anxiety that day, just thinking that she was trying to take over homes and just.
Okay. It's like taking over. What do you mean by taking over homes?
Taking over homes. Yeah. So she was taking over the jobs.
Okay.
Our homes and our jobs.
She keeps throwing out Mexican, taking our jobs, taking our homes. At that point, I knew it was way more serious than what I thought it was. It was a hate crime.
When you went over the curb, did you accelerate? Did you step on the gas?
Yeah.
Did you do it because she was Hispanic? Did that happen? You did? Okay. Were you hoping to injure or actually kill that person?
Yes.
At that time? Yes, at that time. Is that right? Yes. What was your thoughts right after that?
Something for me.
Did it make you feel like I got rid of that bad? Did it make you feel like, hey, I just got rid of this bad person? Yeah. Okay.
I was been having fight like this for a long time.
About?
All the races.
Sure. Okay.
Do you remember if you took your medicine that day?
Okay, so thank you for coming forward. You have no idea, we appreciate it, okay?
When we walked out of the jail, we were both kind of in shock.
Being a minority, I promise you, it hits home.
Both of us were kind of trying to dig for our cell phones, call the county attorney to figure out on the exact charge we were going to pursue at that time.
I'm like, wow, this is way bigger than I thought it was going to get.
There's another sentencing day today for Nicole Poole, the Des Moines woman who tried to run over 2 children on purpose simply because they are minorities.
It was kind of a relief for us. Oh, great, they did it. They found who did it. But then when they give it the notice why she did it, that was heartbreaking.
I was just in a state of shock. I didn't know whether to cry or to scream or to just run away. I knew there was racism in the world, but I never knew that it would happen to me, 2 blocks away from my house.
My wife and I, we had the idea to leave the country forever, but no one is going to push me away. We stayed to prove our kids that they belong here. We can't live in fear, and we can't let that destroy my family.
She just leaves the road. There's nothing to indicate that there was any kind of crash. She just up over the curb, strikes one of the children, back onto the street, just keeps going. The hate-filled motivation seems so apparent to all of us. When we go to charge these crimes, I think law enforcement in the neighborhoods want to send a very strong message that if you commit a crime that's motivated like this, we are going to hit you with the most serious charge we can.
Our investigators heard from the Des Moines Police Department that they were investigating a case where a car had gone up onto the sidewalk and a child had been hit by a car.
And she was the person that did that. We have a single incident, but it just expanded and blossomed into this huge, pattern of activity that she was doing on the whole west side of Des Moines.
I really fear that if she had not been stopped at that point, that there may have been other victims in other ways. It's really disheartening to see where you can take that rage and turn that toward children who've never done anything to you, who are just walking down the sidewalk, as all of our community's kids do every day. This behavior is not acceptable anywhere, especially in Clive.
Those charges carry a 25-year sentence. Question of insanity was certainly raised by her attorney, but she was examined for competency. She understood what she did, and she knew right from wrong, and she pled guilty.
And I really credit our investigators for conducting their interview in a way that made our suspect comfortable enough talking to them, because minus that admission, we would not have ever been able to prove that this was an intentional act.
Well, it's always good to have a taped confession. It really put things all together.
We are so fortunate that these kids have recovered and are going to be able to live normal lives. It was a matter of inches between serious injury and death. We're fortunate that luck was on the side of these two kids.
I really think that God was watching over those two children, because it's miraculous that they didn't get killed.
I just feel sorry for her. I don't feel any hate, because hate is what almost took my daughter's life away. And I don't want to feel the same thing.
At first, I did have anger towards her, but I found out that holding something against her wasn't going to do any good for me. And if anything, I got to the realization that I have to forgive her in order to move on and just go and live my life.
The night before Christmas in 2002 carried a strange kind of silence in Modesto, California. Not the peaceful silence of a holiday evening, but something heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. Christmas lights blinked weakly through fogged windows, and suburban streets lay almost empty, as if the town had already drifted into sleep and forgotten to wake up. Inside one of those quiet homes, a young woman named Lacey Peterson was supposed to be preparing for the most ordinary kind of joy. She was 8 months pregnant, expecting her first child, a baby boy she and her husband had already named Connor. Friends described her as radiant in those final weeks of pregnancy, moving slowly but happily through the routines of anticipation, folding tiny clothes, arranging gifts, talking softly to the life growing inside her. But by Christmas morning, she was gone. No dramatic struggle was witnessed. No shattered windows screamed of forced entry. No immediate alarm bells rang across the neighborhood. Instead, there was only absence. A quiet, unsettling void where a person had been only hours before. And at the center of that void stood her husband, Scott Peterson. At first glance, Scott seemed like the least likely figure to become the focus of a national tragedy. He was soft-spoken, clean-cut, and carried himself with a calmness that some later described as almost detached. He worked in sales, dealing with agricultural fertilizers, a job that kept him traveling around California's Central Valley. To neighbors, the Petersons appeared to be an ordinary young couple building a life in a comfortable suburban home. There were no obvious warning signs, no visible fractures in the image they presented to the world. But the story of Lacey Peterson's disappearance would soon tear through that illusion with brutal force, revealing something far more complicated beneath the surface of normalcy. On the morning of December 24th, Scott told investigators he had planned a simple fishing trip to the San Francisco Bay. He said he left home early, while Lacey was still at home, and drove alone to launch his boat. According to him, it was meant to be a quiet escape before the holiday celebrations. A few hours of solitude on the water. When he returned, he said, the house was empty. At first, that explanation sounded tragic, but plausible. A young pregnant woman gone missing from her home on Christmas Eve. The kind of case that initially suggests a break-in, an abduction, or a random act of violence. Search efforts began quickly. Volunteers flooded the neighborhood. Family members held on to hope that she had simply wandered off, or been taken, and would be found alive. But hope has a way of changing shape under pressure. And as hours turned into days, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge, like cracks slowly forming in glass. Scott's behavior, observed by those closest to the situation, did not always match the expected panic of a man whose pregnant wife had disappeared without explanation. There were moments where he seemed composed, almost controlled, even as the situation around him grew increasingly chaotic. Investigators noted small details, fragments of conversation, timing discrepancies, and shifts in his statements that did not align cleanly with the unfolding timeline. Then came something even more complicated, another life Scott had not spoken about openly at first. As detectives dug deeper, they discovered that Scott had been involved in an extramarital relationship with a woman named Amber Fry. At first, she had no idea that the man she was dating had a missing pregnant wife. When she learned the truth, she made a decision that would become crucial to the investigation. She agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. Through recorded phone calls, Amber unknowingly helped build a psychological window into Scott's behavior during the days after Lacey disappeared. In those conversations, Scott often spoke carefully, sometimes evasively. What stood out was not always what he said, but what he avoided saying. There were moments where he spoke as if Lacey's absence was already a settled reality, rather than an ongoing emergency. Meanwhile, the search for Lacey expanded beyond Modesto, reaching waterways, shorelines, and distant stretches of coastline. The image of a missing pregnant woman became national news. Her face appeared on television screens across America, a symbol of vulnerability and unanswered questions. Months passed like that, suspended between uncertainty and growing dread. Then, in April 2003, the case shifted in a way no one could ignore. Two separate discoveries were made along the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay. First a small body, then another, both badly decomposed after months in the water. Dental records confirmed what investigators already feared. The remains belonged to Lacey Peterson and her unborn son. The discovery did not bring closure in the way families often hope for. Instead, it intensified everything. The case was no longer about a missing person. It was now a double homicide investigation. The location of the bodies also raised difficult questions. They were found not far from the area Scott had said he went fishing on the day Lacey disappeared. The water, the tides, the currents all became part of a growing forensic puzzle that investigators tried to piece together with painstaking detail. The medical examination suggested that Lacey and her unborn child had died before being placed in the water. That single conclusion transformed the direction of the entire case. It suggested intent, action, and a timeline that no longer matched the original narrative of a simple disappearance. As suspicion intensified, so did public attention. Cameras followed Scott wherever he went. Reporters dissected every statement, every movement, every facial expression. The story had shifted from a missing person case into something darker, a domestic tragedy unfolding under the harsh light of national scrutiny. But even as pressure mounted, there was still no direct evidence. No eyewitness. No murder weapon. No confession. The case rested heavily on circumstantial connections, behavioral interpretations, and forensic timing. And yet, investigators believed they were closing in on a truth that was not immediately visible on the surface. The emotional tone of the case began to change. What had once been a story of hope turned into something heavier, more accusatory, more divided. Public opinion fractured. Some believed Scott was guilty, pointing to inconsistencies and the affair as motive. Others argued that suspicion alone could not replace hard evidence, and warned against the dangers of convicting someone based on perception. Inside the courtroom of public opinion, Scott Peterson was already being judged long before a legal verdict was reached. But beneath all of that noise, one question remained suspended in the center of everything, unshaken and unresolved. What happened to Laci Peterson in those final hours before she vanished? The answer would require more than headlines or speculation. It would require a deep reconstruction of time, behavior, and contradiction. A slow unraveling of events that seemed ordinary on the surface, but carried something far more disturbing underneath. And as investigators prepared to move forward, they were about to enter a case that would challenge not only the boundaries of evidence, but the limits of certainty itself. Modesto, California, at the beginning of the 2000s was the kind of place that rarely made national headlines. It was a city built on agricultural land, surrounded by endless stretches of farmland, orchards, and irrigation canals that reflected the pale gold of the Central Valley sun. Life moved at a steady, almost predictable rhythm there. Mornings were marked by commuters heading toward nearby cities like Stockton or Sacramento, afternoons by the hum of retail stores and school pickups, and evenings by the quiet glow of suburban homes lined in neat rows. It was not a city that expected to become the center of a national tragedy. Yet in many ways, its very ordinariness would later make the events surrounding the Peterson case feel even more unsettling. The Peterson home sat in one of these quiet residential neighborhoods, the kind where children rode bicycles in the street and neighbors exchanged brief greetings while retrieving mail. The house itself was modest but comfortable, with a tidy exterior that reflected a sense of stability. From the outside, nothing about it suggested that its walls contained anything other than an ordinary young couple preparing for their first child. Inside that home lived Laci Peterson, a woman who, by all outward appearances, embodied a gentle kind of optimism. She was in her mid-20s, petite, with a warmth that people often described as natural rather than performed. She had grown up in California and carried with her the familiar rhythm of Central Valley life, where family, community, and routine formed the backbone of daily existence. Laci's life before her marriage had been shaped by small ambitions and creative interests. She studied ornamental horticulture at college, drawn to beauty in natural form, but later shifted toward interior design. At one point she worked part-time at a retail store, a job that placed her in constant interaction with customers, where her friendly demeanor became part of her identity. Those who knew her often remembered her not through grand achievements, but through small gestures, the way she listened carefully, or how she smiled easily in conversation. Her world began to intertwine with Scott Peterson's in a way that seemed, at least in its early stages, almost unremarkable. They met in the late 1990s, at a restaurant where she worked part-time. Scott, at the time, presented himself as confident and composed, someone who carried an air of quiet certainty. He was studying at college, moving toward a business degree, and seemed focused on building a stable future. Their relationship developed steadily. Friends would later describe it as conventional, without dramatic beginnings or obvious turbulence. They dated for a few years, shared routines, and eventually married in 1997. To those around them, it appeared to be a natural progression, the kind of relationship that fit neatly into the expectations of suburban adulthood. After marriage, Scott entered the agricultural sales industry, working for a company that dealt in fertilizers and farming products. His job required frequent travel across California's agricultural regions, visiting farms, attending trade shows, and maintaining client relationships. It was not glamorous work, but it was stable, and in a place like Modesto, stability often mattered more than ambition. Laci, meanwhile, continued to shape her own identity within the structure of marriage. She pursued interior design studies and took on part-time work. At home, she was known for her attention to detail, especially as she began preparing for motherhood. By late 2002, she was 8 months pregnant, and the pregnancy had become the central focus of her life. Friends described her as excited, almost glowing with anticipation, carefully selecting baby clothes, decorating the nursery, and talking about the future in soft, hopeful terms. The baby, a boy they named Connor, represented a new chapter that seemed to anchor the couple even more firmly into the image of stability. To outsiders, it was the picture of a young family stepping into its next stage, preparing for sleepless nights, first steps, and the ordinary chaos of parenthood. But beneath the surface of that image, life was not as static as it appeared. Scott's work schedule often placed him away from home, and the rhythm of travel created physical distance within the marriage. Long drives through California highways, nights spent in hotels, and the repetitive nature of sales territory slowly built a life where absence became routine. In many marriages, such distance is absorbed into the structure of trust. But it also creates spaces where private lives can become more complicated. In the final months of 2002, the holiday season approached with its usual mixture of anticipation and pressure. Stores filled with seasonal decorations, neighborhoods lit up with strings of white and colored lights, and families prepared for gatherings that would briefly interrupt their routines. For the Petersons, Christmas was expected to be spent quietly, a domestic holiday centered around their unborn child and immediate family. December in Modesto carried a specific kind of atmosphere. The air was cool in the mornings, but often warmed by midday sun. Fog occasionally settled over the fields at night, creating a muted landscape where streetlights glowed softly through haze. It was a season that felt calm on the surface, yet carried an underlying tension that comes with the end of the year, when people reflect on time passing and the changes it brings. Within this environment, the Peterson household continued its preparations. Lacey, nearing the final stages of pregnancy, moved more slowly through daily tasks. Simple actions like walking, sitting, or standing carried the physical weight of her condition. Yet there was also a visible tenderness in the way she approached this time, as if she was carefully holding on to each moment before life changed permanently. Scott's presence during this period was more difficult to define through outside observation. To some, he appeared calm and focused on the upcoming arrival of his son. To others, there were subtle signs of emotional distance, moments where his attention seemed elsewhere, though such impressions were often vague and open to interpretation. What is clear, however, is that by the time December 24 arrived, the Peterson home existed within a world that looked ordinary from the outside, but was internally shaped by private complexities that few could see. The neighborhood itself remained unaware of anything unusual. Houses decorated for Christmas lined the streets, children played outside during the day, and families prepared for holiday gatherings. There was no visible disruption in the rhythm of suburban life. Even the weather on that morning offered nothing unusual, just another cool winter day in California's Central Valley. Yet within this familiar setting, every detail would soon take on a different meaning. Ordinary actions would be re-examined. Routine movements would be reconstructed. Conversations that once seemed insignificant would be replayed and analyzed with intense scrutiny. Modesto would become more than just a backdrop. It would become a map of memory, every street and intersection holding potential significance in a timeline that investigators would later try to rebuild piece by piece. And as Christmas Eve unfolded, the quiet stability of this environment would begin to fracture in ways that no one living within it could yet understand. Before the world learned her name through tragedy, Lacey Peterson was simply a young woman living a life that, in many ways, mirrored the quiet hopes of countless others in suburban California. She was not a public figure, not someone who sought attention, or lived in the shadow of fame. Her story, at its core, began in ordinary places: school hallways, part-time jobs, family dinners, and the slow shaping of adulthood in a city that rarely paused to notice individual lives unless something went wrong. Those who knew her often described her in fragments that, when pieced together, formed an image of someone gentle but grounded. She was small in stature, with soft features that gave her an approachable presence. Her voice was calm, her manner patient, and there was a consistent warmth in how she interacted with people, even in passing. It was not a loud or demanding kind of personality. Instead, it was the kind that made people feel slightly more at ease in her presence without necessarily realizing why. Lacey grew up in California's Central Valley, a region defined by agricultural land, long highways, and communities that often felt closely tied even when physically spread apart. Her childhood was not marked by dramatic events or public attention. It was shaped instead by routine, school activities, and family life that revolved around shared meals, holidays, and local traditions. In many ways, her early years reflected stability, though like any life, they contained their own private complexities that only those closest to her would fully understand. As she entered her teenage years, she began to develop a stronger sense of personal identity. Friends from that time recall her as social, but not overwhelming, someone who moved comfortably between different groups without needing to dominate attention. She had an interest in aesthetics, in how spaces and objects could be arranged to create comfort or beauty. That interest eventually led her toward studies in ornamental horticulture, where she explored plant life, design principles, and the relationship between nature and human environments. There was something fitting about this choice, as it reflected a desire to shape and care for things that grew slowly over time. It was not a field that promised instant recognition or dramatic success, but rather one that required patience and attention to detail. In many ways, it mirrored aspects of her own personality. During her college years, Lacey worked part-time jobs, one of which would eventually become significant in her personal story. She took a position at a restaurant where she met Scott Peterson. At the time, their meeting did not carry any sense of inevitability or dramatic foreshadowing. It was a simple encounter in a workplace environment, the kind that happens frequently in young adult life. Scott was older by a few years, composed, and appeared confident in social situations. He carried himself with a quiet certainty that some found reassuring. Their early interactions developed gradually, without sudden intensity. They spoke, they spent time together, and over time a relationship formed that felt steady rather than turbulent. To friends observing from the outside, the relationship seemed conventional. There were no obvious red flags, no visible conflicts that suggested instability. They dated for several years before eventually marrying in 1997. The wedding itself was described as modest and joyful, attended by family and close friends, marking the beginning of what appeared to be a stable partnership. Marriage shifted Lacey into a new phase of life. She moved into domestic routines, managing household responsibilities while continuing her studies and part-time work. Like many young couples, they were building a life from the ground up, navigating finances, careers, and shared decisions about the future. There were discussions about long-term goals, including children, home ownership, and professional stability. Friends from this period often describe Lacey as someone who embraced the idea of family life. She spoke about wanting children and creating a home environment filled with warmth. She was not portrayed as someone chasing ambition in a public sense, but rather someone who found meaning in personal relationships and future planning. Scott's career in agricultural sales placed him in a different rhythm of life. His work required travel across California, visiting farms, meeting clients, and managing sales territories that stretched across rural and semi-rural regions. This created periods of separation between him and Lacey, with days spent apart due to work schedules. In many marriages, such separation becomes part of normal adjustment. It requires trust, communication, and adaptation to distance. As the years passed, the couple settled into a predictable structure. Their life was not marked by public drama or visible instability. To neighbors, they appeared like any other young married couple living in suburban California, navigating the ordinary pressures of adulthood. But beneath the surface of that ordinary structure, life was quietly accumulating layers that were not always visible from the outside. By 2002, Lacey's life had begun to center increasingly on pregnancy. She and Scott were expecting their first child, a boy they named Connor. Pregnancy transformed her daily experience in ways that were both physical and emotional. Her routine slowed, her focus narrowed, and her anticipation for motherhood became a defining aspect of her identity during those months. Those close to her recall that she embraced the pregnancy with visible excitement. She prepared the nursery, organized baby clothes, and spoke often about the future. There was a sense of forward motion in her life, a belief that she was stepping into a new chapter that would bring stability and meaning. Physically, she was in the later stages of pregnancy by December 2002, which meant her movements were slower, her energy more limited, and her presence at home more central. She spent more time indoors, focusing on preparation and rest. The unborn child became a constant presence in both her thoughts and her environment, shaping decisions and daily habits. At this stage of pregnancy, most women experience a heightened awareness of routine and safety. Simple actions like walking outside, driving short distances, or managing household tasks take on additional consideration. It is a period in which the world feels both intimate and fragile, where anticipation of new life exists alongside physical vulnerability. Within her social circle, Lacey remained connected to family and friends. She maintained regular communication, attended gatherings when possible, and continued to engage in everyday interactions that reflected her grounded personality. There was nothing in her behavior that suggested distance or withdrawal from her support system. The holiday season of 2002 added another layer of emotional context. Christmas is often a time when families gather, reflect, and prepare for transitions into a new year. For Lacey, this period carried the added significance of impending motherhood. The idea of spending Christmas with her husband and unborn child created a sense of completion, as if life was aligning into a stable and meaningful form. Those who saw her during this time often remember her as calm, focused, and quietly happy. She was not described as anxious or troubled, but rather as someone moving through a natural progression of life stages. Yet even in lives that appear stable, there are always unseen dimensions. Every individual carries private thoughts, unspoken concerns, and subtle emotional shifts that may not be visible to others. In Lacey's case, those private dimensions remain largely known only through fragments of memory and interpretation from those around her. What is certain is that by the time December 2002 reached its final days, Lacey Peterson was deeply embedded in the role of an expectant mother preparing for a new beginning. Her life, as it was understood by those closest to her, was oriented toward the future, toward family, and toward the arrival of her son. She was not a public figure. She was not part of any larger narrative at that time. She was a young woman living within the familiar boundaries of suburban life, surrounded by relationships, routines, and expectations that defined her world. And yet, as history would later reveal, it is often within the most ordinary lives that the most unexpected tragedies take root, hidden beneath layers of normalcy that only become visible when everything else has already changed. December 24, 2002 began like a day that had not yet decided what it would become. In Modesto, the morning light arrived slowly, filtered through a thin layer of winter haze that softened the edges of houses and streets. The air was cool, but not harsh, carrying the quiet stillness of a holiday eve when most people were already thinking about family gatherings, travel plans, or simply staying inside where warmth felt safer than the outside world. Inside the Peterson home, the morning followed a familiar rhythm. There was no indication that this day would separate itself from any other day in the life of a young couple preparing for Christmas. The household moved through its routines in a way that, to an outside observer, would have appeared completely ordinary. Small actions, simple conversations, and the predictable structure of domestic life unfolded without urgency. Lacey Peterson, in the final weeks of her pregnancy, was at a stage where even routine movements required more effort. Getting dressed, walking through the house, and managing everyday tasks had become slower, more deliberate. Yet she remained active within the limits of her condition, continuing to prepare for the arrival of her baby boy, Connor. There were still small things she intended to do that day, ordinary plans that belonged to a life centered around home and anticipation. Scott Peterson, according to his later account, was also beginning his day with a plan that seemed simple on the surface. He intended to go fishing in the San Francisco Bay, a short trip before returning home to spend Christmas Eve with his wife and family. It was not presented as anything unusual at the time. A man going out for a few hours on a holiday morning did not, in itself, suggest anything out of place. But what would later define this day was not how it began, but how it ended, and more importantly, what could not be fully reconstructed between those 2 points. At some point in the late morning hours, Scott left the house. The exact timing of his departure would later become part of the detailed investigation, carefully examined through phone records, witness statements, and his own shifting explanations. What is known is that he drove toward the coast, carrying with him fishing equipment and a small boat. The destination he described was the Barkley Marina area, a familiar location for recreational fishing. Back in Modesto, Lacey remained at home. She was in the final stage of pregnancy, a period where movement becomes more restricted and daily activity often centers around the immediate environment of the house. There is no clear indication that she had planned to leave the home that morning. Her presence there, according to early statements and observations, was consistent with her routine behavior during that stage of pregnancy. As the morning progressed, the neighborhood around the Peterson home continued its quiet holiday rhythm. Cars passed occasionally, people moved in and out of houses carrying last-minute items, and the general atmosphere remained calm. There was nothing in the external environment that suggested disruption or alarm. At some point during the day, communication between Scott and Lacey ceased. There were no confirmed phone conversations that indicated distress or unusual activity. The silence, in itself, was not immediately alarming, as holiday schedules often create irregular communication patterns within families. It would only gain significance later, once the timeline began to unravel under investigation. By the time Scott claimed to have returned home, the structure of the day began to shift from ordinary to uncertain. According to his account, he arrived back at the house in the afternoon or early evening and discovered that Lacey was not there. The house, he said, was empty. Her personal belongings were still present, but she was missing. In that moment, the narrative of the day changed direction. Scott reported her disappearance shortly afterward, though the exact sequence of those initial actions would later become a subject of scrutiny. Before contacting authorities, he informed certain individuals that Lacey was missing. These early communications would later be examined closely, particularly the timing and wording of how he described the situation. When police first became involved, the case initially appeared to fit a pattern that law enforcement often encounters in missing person investigations. A pregnant woman missing from her home on a holiday eve immediately raised concern, but without clear evidence of violence, forced entry, or witness accounts, investigators had to begin with an open set of possibilities. The initial search focused on the immediate environment, the house, the surrounding neighborhood, and nearby areas where Lacey might have gone for a walk or encountered some form of emergency. Family members quickly became involved, mobilizing friends and volunteers to help search nearby parks, streets, and public spaces. At this early stage, hope and confusion existed side by side. There was still room for explanations that did not involve violence. Accidental disappearance, medical emergency, or even voluntary absence were all considered in the absence of concrete evidence. However, as the hours passed, the situation began to feel less like a simple missing person case and more like something that resisted easy categorization. Small inconsistencies in the timeline began to emerge during early interviews. Details about Scott's movements, his communication before and after returning home, and his exact sequence of actions were not always presented in a consistent manner. Investigators began documenting these variations carefully. In missing person cases, early discrepancies are not uncommon, especially under emotional stress. But they still form an important part of the investigative process, as they help establish whether the narrative remains stable over time. Meanwhile, the Peterson home became a focal point of activity. Family members gathered, police came and went, and the house itself shifted from private space to active investigation site. The emotional atmosphere inside the home changed rapidly. What had been a space of anticipation for a holiday and an upcoming birth was now filled with uncertainty and growing tension. Outside, the neighborhood began to take notice. The presence of police vehicles, media interest, and search efforts transformed the previously quiet street into something more visible and unsettled. Neighbors who had once experienced the Petersons as an ordinary couple now found themselves drawn into a situation they could not fully understand. As night approached on December 24th, the contrast between expectation and reality became sharper. Christmas Eve, typically associated with gathering and warmth, instead carried a sense of absence and unresolved questions. Lights still decorated houses, but the emotional tone of the day had shifted. At this stage, no one yet understood the full scope of what had occurred. The absence of Lacey Peterson was still officially a disappearance, not yet defined by conclusions or confirmed outcomes. The investigation was in its earliest phase, shaped by incomplete information and the urgent need to establish a reliable timeline. But even in those first hours, the foundation of the case was already forming. Every movement, every statement, and every piece of physical evidence would soon become part of a larger reconstruction of events that would take months to fully develop. December 24th did not reveal its meaning immediately. It only marked the beginning of a process that would slowly transform a quiet suburban morning into one of the most closely examined criminal cases in modern American history. By the time law enforcement arrived at the Peterson home on Covina Avenue, the quiet certainty of the previous day had already begun to dissolve into something far more fragile. What had started as a missing person report was now becoming a scene of structured uncertainty, where every room, every object, and every trace of movement had to be reconsidered under a different lens. The house itself appeared untouched in any violent sense. There were no broken doors, no signs of forced entry, no visible struggle that would immediately suggest an abduction or home invasion. This absence of obvious disturbance created an early complication for investigators. In many cases, physical evidence provides the first direction of inquiry, but here the silence of the environment offered very little clarity. Inside, the layout of the home reflected the life of a young couple preparing for parenthood. Rooms were orderly, decorated with the quiet anticipation of a nursery that was still in progress. Baby items were present, some already arranged, others waiting to be organized. The atmosphere of preparation remained frozen in time, interrupted rather than completed. Lacey's personal belongings were still in place. Her purse, keys, and other everyday items were found inside the home, suggesting that she had not planned to leave for an extended period. Her car was parked outside, further complicating early assumptions about her movements. Nothing immediately indicated a planned departure, yet nothing confirmed what had happened in the hours before she vanished. For investigators, the first priority was to reconstruct a timeline. That process began with interviews, starting with Scott Peterson. His account of the day was detailed in some areas and less precise in others. He described leaving early in the morning for a fishing trip, traveling alone toward the San Francisco Bay, and returning later in the day to find his wife missing. On the surface, this narrative provided a simple structure, but investigators are trained to look beyond structure and into consistency. As questions began, subtle variations in his responses emerged. Times were not always exact. Sequences of events shifted slightly depending on the retelling. These inconsistencies were not immediately treated as evidence of wrongdoing, but they became points of interest that required further verification. Meanwhile, attention turned outward from the house to the surrounding environment. Detectives began canvassing the neighborhood, speaking with residents, asking whether anyone had seen or heard unusual activity on the morning of December 24th. The goal was to identify any external witnesses who might provide independent confirmation of movement around the home. The responses from neighbors were largely consistent in one respect. The area had appeared normal that morning. There were no reports of disturbances, no sounds of conflict, and no unusual visitors observed entering or leaving the Peterson residence. This absence of external observation created a significant challenge. Without witnesses, the case depended heavily on internal accounts and physical interpretation. Search efforts expanded quickly. Volunteers joined family members in looking through nearby parks, streets, and public spaces. Flyers were distributed, and Lacey's image began circulating locally. The urgency of the search was driven not only by her disappearance, but also by her advanced pregnancy, which added emotional weight to every passing hour. Inside the investigation, detectives began focusing more closely on Scott Peterson's movements that day. His claim of a solo fishing trip became a central point of verification. Investigators examined boat launch records, parking information, and marina activity. The goal was to confirm whether his stated timeline matched external evidence. At the same time, attention turned to phone records. Communication patterns before, during, and after the time of disappearance were analyzed to identify any irregularities or gaps. These records would later play a significant role in constructing a more detailed timeline of events. As interviews continued, investigators also began to observe behavioral responses. Scott's demeanor during questioning was noted, including how he responded to repeated inquiries about timing and sequence. These observations were not treated as conclusions, but as additional layers of context within a broader investigative framework. Family members of Lacey became deeply involved in the search effort. Her mother, father, and relatives participated in organizing volunteers, coordinating media outreach, and maintaining public attention on her disappearance. Their presence added emotional intensity to the situation, transforming it from a private investigation into a highly visible public concern. As days passed, the case began to evolve beyond its initial classification. The lack of physical evidence pointing to an external abduction shifted investigative focus inward, toward the possibility that the explanation might lie closer to home. This shift is not immediate in missing person cases, but it often develops when external leads fail to produce results. During this period, investigators also re-examined the interior of the home with greater detail. Every room was reviewed again, not for obvious signs of violence, but for subtle indications of movement, disruption, or overlooked detail. Even ordinary objects became potential indicators of behavior patterns or timing. Outside the home, media presence began to grow. What had initially been a local concern was now attracting regional attention. Reporters gathered near the neighborhood, capturing images of search efforts and interviewing family members. The public narrative of a missing pregnant woman began to take shape, adding pressure to the investigative process. Within this environment, Scott Peterson's role in the case became increasingly central. As the last known person to have been with Lacey, his account formed the foundation of the initial timeline. Investigators worked carefully to verify each element of his statement, comparing it against available data and external observation. At this stage, however, there was still no definitive evidence pointing toward a specific conclusion. The case remained open, defined by uncertainty and competing possibilities. Accidental disappearance, external abduction, and internal involvement were all still theoretically possible, though each carried different implications that required careful evaluation. As the first days of investigation unfolded, the absence of clear answers began to shape the emotional tone of the case. Families on both sides were left in a state of suspended hope, unable to move forward while waiting for clarity that had not yet arrived. What emerged during this early phase was not resolution, but structure. A framework of time, behavior, and observation began to form, even if its meaning was not yet understood. Every detail collected during these initial hours would later become part of a larger reconstruction, one that would attempt to explain how an ordinary morning could lead to such an extraordinary disappearance. The discovery of truth, however, was still far ahead. At this moment, investigators stood at the beginning of a path that was still largely invisible, guided only by fragments of information, and the difficult task of separating appearance from reality. As the investigation into Laci Peterson's disappearance moved beyond its earliest hours, the case began to shift in a subtle but significant way. What had initially been treated as a missing person investigation was now expanding into something more complex, where every possible explanation was being weighed against emerging inconsistencies. In this stage, the role of investigators changed from searching outward for a lost individual to carefully examining the people and circumstances closest to her final known location. Scott Peterson, as her husband and the last confirmed person to see her, naturally became the central figure of interest. This was not an immediate accusation, but rather a procedural reality in investigative work. When a person disappears under unclear circumstances, law enforcement must begin with those closest to them, not out of assumption, but out of necessity. The timeline begins at the point of last confirmed contact, and in this case, that point led directly back to the home on Covina Avenue. Initial interviews with Scott were structured around reconstructing his movements on December 24. He described waking up early, preparing for a fishing trip, and driving alone to the San Francisco Bay Area. According to his account, he spent several hours on the water before returning home in the afternoon, where he discovered that Laci was missing. This narrative, while straightforward in structure, became increasingly important as investigators attempted to align it with external evidence. At first, there was no immediate contradiction that could be confirmed. However, investigators are trained to look beyond surface consistency and examine the finer details of timing, behavior, and corroboration. In Scott's case, the precision of his timeline began to draw attention. Small variations appeared when he repeated his account at different times. While such inconsistencies are not unusual in stressful situations, they became relevant when placed alongside other findings. One of the earliest areas of verification involved the marina and boating records. Scott had stated that he went fishing alone. Investigators examined launch records and spoke with personnel at the Barkley Marina to confirm whether his boat had been launched and retrieved according to his stated timeline. They also analyzed parking information and environmental conditions that might support or challenge his version of events. What emerged from this process was not a single definitive contradiction, but a series of partial confirmations and unresolved gaps. Some elements of his story aligned with known data, while others could not be independently verified. This partial alignment created an investigative tension, where the narrative could not be fully accepted or fully dismissed. At the same time, detectives began to examine Scott's personal life in greater detail. This included reviewing communication records, financial activity, and social interactions. It was during this phase that investigators discovered his relationship with Amber Fry, a woman who had been dating Scott without knowledge of his marriage circumstances. This discovery introduced a new dimension to the investigation. While infidelity alone does not establish criminal behavior, it can provide context for motive, emotional state, and behavioral patterns. Investigators approached this information carefully, recognizing that its value lay not in assumption, but in how it intersected with other evidence. Amber Fry's cooperation with law enforcement became a crucial development. She agreed to allow her conversations with Scott to be recorded, providing investigators with an unfiltered view of his communication during the period immediately following Lacey's disappearance. These recordings were not presented as definitive proof, but as behavioral data that could be analyzed alongside other evidence. In those conversations, investigators noted patterns that required careful interpretation. The tone of discussions, the framing of events, and the absence or presence of certain details all became part of a broader psychological profile being constructed around Scott's behavior during this critical time period. Meanwhile, search efforts for Lacey continued across multiple locations. Waterways, shorelines, and surrounding regions were systematically examined. The search was exhaustive in scope, reflecting both the urgency of the situation and the lack of concrete leads. Despite extensive effort, there was still no physical evidence confirming her whereabouts. As days turned into weeks, the investigation became increasingly dependent on reconstruction rather than discovery. Without immediate physical evidence of an external abduction, attention continued to focus inward, toward the possibility that the explanation might involve someone within her immediate environment. Within the home, forensic teams conducted detailed examinations. They looked for trace evidence, environmental disturbances, and any subtle indicators that might suggest what had occurred inside the house on the morning of December 24. Even minor details, such as the arrangement of objects or the presence of specific materials, were carefully documented and analyzed. At the same time, investigators re-examined the timeline provided by Scott. Each segment of his account was compared against external data points. The goal was not to disprove his narrative outright, but to determine whether it could be independently supported. In cases where verification was not possible, those gaps became areas of further inquiry. Public attention during this phase began to intensify. As news of the investigation spread, the case transitioned from a local missing person report into a nationally followed story. Media coverage introduced additional pressure, not only on investigators, but also on the family and community involved. Every development was scrutinized, often interpreted through the lens of speculation as well as fact. Despite this growing attention, investigators maintained a methodical approach. They avoided drawing conclusions prematurely, focusing instead on building a comprehensive understanding of events. This required patience, as the absence of direct evidence meant that each new piece of information had to be carefully integrated into an already complex framework. Family members of Lacey continued to play an active role in search efforts and public outreach. Their involvement kept the case visible and sustained momentum in the search for answers. At the same time, they were navigating their own emotional experience, balancing hope with the increasing uncertainty of the situation. Within the investigative team, discussions began to shift toward evaluating behavioral patterns alongside physical evidence. Scott's actions before and after the disappearance, his communication patterns, and his interactions with others were all examined as part of a broader effort to understand the sequence of events. This phase of the investigation was marked by accumulation rather than resolution. Information was gathered from multiple sources, but interpretation remained cautious. Investigators were aware that premature conclusions could compromise the integrity of the case. As the search continued without physical recovery, the investigation increasingly relied on reconstructing the day in question through indirect evidence. This included analyzing weather conditions, tidal movements in the bay, and environmental factors that could influence both travel and visibility. Each of these elements contributed to a growing but incomplete picture. The challenge was not a lack of information, but rather the difficulty of connecting fragmented pieces into a coherent narrative that could be supported beyond reasonable doubt. By the end of this phase, the investigation had entered a critical stage of development. The focus had narrowed, the questions had sharpened, and the available evidence had begun to form patterns that demanded closer scrutiny. Yet despite this progress, the central mystery remained unresolved. Laci Peterson was still missing. The explanation for her disappearance was still not confirmed. And the investigation, while deeper and more focused than before, was now entering a territory where answers would require not just evidence, but interpretation of everything that had been gathered so far. The investigation into Laci Peterson's disappearance entered a far more complex and psychologically charged phase as the initial shock of the case gave way to structured scrutiny. What had begun as a desperate search for a missing pregnant woman was now transforming into a methodical examination of relationships, timelines, and human behavior under pressure. At this stage, investigators were no longer only asking where Laci might be, but increasingly focusing on how the last known hours of her life were shaped, and by whom. Scott Peterson remained at the center of attention, not because of immediate proof, but because of his proximity to the final confirmed point in the timeline. In investigative work, proximity does not imply guilt, but it does determine direction. Detectives began reconstructing his movements with increasing precision, breaking his account into segments that could be verified independently. The goal was not to accept or reject his story as a whole, but to test each component against external reality. The fishing trip he described became a critical focal point. Investigators examined marina logs, boat trailer movements, and environmental conditions on the San Francisco Bay that morning. They studied tidal charts, wind patterns, and water temperature, attempting to determine whether his timeline was physically consistent with what he claimed. Each element of his account was treated as a separate variable in a larger reconstruction. What they found was not immediate contradiction, but fragmentation. Some details aligned with known conditions, while others could not be independently confirmed. This created a space of ambiguity that investigators had to navigate carefully. In cases like this, ambiguity does not close a case, it deepens it. At the same time, attention turned to Scott's personal life, where a parallel narrative was quietly unfolding. Investigators discovered that he had been involved in a relationship with a woman named Amber Fry, a fact that had not been disclosed during the early stages of the investigation. This revelation added a new layer to the case, not as direct evidence of wrongdoing, but as a potential window into emotional and behavioral contexts. Amber Fry's cooperation with law enforcement became a turning point in how investigators accessed information about Scott's state of mind during the days following Laci's disappearance. Through recorded conversations, they were able to observe how he spoke about his situation when he believed he was in a private setting. These recordings were not treated as conclusive proof of anything on their own, but as behavioral data that could be compared against other evidence. What stood out to investigators was not a single statement, but patterns in communication. The way certain topics were avoided, the timing of disclosures, and the emotional framing of events all became subjects of careful analysis. In behavioral investigation, it is often the structure of communication rather than its content that provides insight into state of mind. While this was unfolding, search efforts for Laci expanded dramatically. Law enforcement, volunteers, and family members searched waterways, shoreline areas, and surrounding terrain. Helicopters scanned large stretches of the bay, while ground teams combed through parks and open land. The scale of the search reflected both the urgency of the case and the absence of physical leads. Despite these efforts, no immediate trace of Laci was found. The lack of discovery created a growing tension within the investigation. In many missing person cases, physical evidence eventually provides direction. Here, the absence of such evidence forced investigators to rely increasingly on reconstruction and inference. Inside the Peterson home, forensic teams conducted detailed examinations. They looked for trace materials, environmental disturbances, and microscopic evidence that might indicate what had occurred within the space on December 24. Even in the absence of visible struggle, forensic science allows investigators to search for less obvious indicators of movement and contact. Every object in the home was reviewed in context. The position of items, the state of rooms, and the presence or absence of personal belongings all contributed to a broader understanding of how the household functioned on that morning. Investigators were particularly focused on identifying whether the environment reflected routine activity or abrupt interruption. As these analyses continued, the timeline of December 24 became increasingly central. Each hour was reconstructed using a combination of statements, physical evidence, and external verification. Scott's account remained the primary narrative of that day, but it was now being cross-examined against independent data sources. At the same time, investigators began to expand their focus beyond physical evidence into behavioral patterns. Scott's actions after reporting Lacey missing were carefully documented. This included his communication with family members, his interactions with law enforcement, and his public behavior during the early stages of the search. These observations were not used in isolation, but rather as part of a broader effort to understand consistency across different contexts. In investigative psychology, consistency between emotional response and situational expectation can provide important context, though it is never used alone as proof. Public attention to the case began to intensify during this phase. Media coverage expanded rapidly, transforming the investigation into a national story. Images of Lacey circulated widely, and the narrative of a missing pregnant woman resonated deeply with the public. This attention added pressure to the investigative process, requiring law enforcement to balance transparency with procedural caution. As coverage increased, so did speculation. Public opinion began to form around incomplete information, with interpretations of Scott's behavior divided between suspicion and skepticism. Some viewed inconsistencies in his account as significant indicators of guilt, while others emphasized the absence of direct evidence. Within the investigative team, however, conclusions were not being drawn. Instead, the focus remained on building a structured understanding of events based on verified data. Each new piece of information was evaluated in relation to the existing timeline, with careful attention to reliability and source. Family members of Lacey remained actively involved in search efforts and public appeals. Their presence kept the emotional dimension of the case visible, reminding both investigators and the public that behind the structure of the investigation was a deeply personal loss still unresolved. As days turned into weeks, the case gradually shifted from active search to sustained investigation. The absence of physical discovery forced a transition toward analytical reconstruction. Investigators began focusing more heavily on integrating all available information into a coherent sequence of events, even as critical gaps remained. By this stage, the investigation had developed a layered structure. Physical evidence, behavioral analysis, timeline reconstruction, and environmental factors were all being considered simultaneously. Yet despite this complexity, the central question remained unanswered. The precise events that led to Lacey Peterson's disappearance were still not fully understood. What had emerged, however, was a framework of inquiry that was becoming increasingly detailed. Each contradiction, each confirmed detail, and each unresolved gap was shaping the direction of the investigation. The case was no longer defined by absence alone, but by the gradual accumulation of structured uncertainty. And within that uncertainty, investigators continued to search for a point of clarity that would eventually transform fragments of information into a complete narrative. As the investigation deepened, the Scott Peterson case reached a point where scattered fragments of information began to converge into something more focused, though still not fully resolved. For weeks, investigators had been collecting statements, physical evidence, environmental data, and behavioral observations. Each piece on its own remained incomplete, but together they started forming patterns that demanded closer attention. This was the stage where the investigation moved beyond searching and into interpretation, where the meaning of evidence became just as important as its existence. One of the most significant developments came from the continued reconstruction of Scott Peterson's timeline on December 24. Investigators revisited marina records, satellite imagery, witness statements, and physical conditions on the San Francisco Bay. They were trying to determine whether his described fishing trip could be fully supported by independent evidence, or whether gaps in that timeline suggested something unaccounted for. While parts of his account aligned with known environmental conditions, other sections remained unverifiable. The absence of clear witnesses who observed him actively fishing in the area he described became a subtle but important factor. In isolation, this was not conclusive, but in combination with other inconsistencies, it added weight to the growing list of unanswered questions. At the same time, forensic analysis of the Peterson home and surrounding environment continued. Investigators had already established that there were no obvious signs of forced entry or external struggle. This absence shifted attention inward, toward the possibility that whatever had occurred may have originated inside the household rather than outside it. That shift in perspective significantly changed the direction of the investigation. Inside the home, every detail was re-examined with heightened scrutiny. The arrangement of personal belongings, the state of rooms, and the presence of everyday items were all analyzed to determine whether they reflected a normal morning routine or an interruption in expected behavior. Small details that might normally be overlooked became important data points in reconstructing the sequence of events. As investigators worked through these physical elements, another major thread of the case continued developing in parallel: Scott Peterson's personal relationships. The discovery of his involvement with Amber Fry had already introduced a new dimension to the investigation, but as recorded conversations were reviewed more carefully, investigators began to map behavioral patterns that extended beyond simple infidelity. The conversations revealed a structure of communication that appeared carefully managed. Timing of disclosures, emotional framing, and selective omission of details all became part of the analysis. Investigators were particularly interested in how Scott described his personal situation during the period immediately following Lacey's disappearance, especially in contexts where he believed he was speaking privately. These behavioral observations did not serve as standalone evidence, but they contributed to a broader psychological profile being developed by investigators. In complex cases, understanding behavior under stress can provide context for interpreting actions, even when it does not directly prove intent. Meanwhile, the search for Lacey and her unborn son continued across multiple environments. Waterways remained a primary focus due to Scott's fishing trip explanation. Search teams examined tidal flows, underwater terrain, and drift patterns to determine where physical evidence might have been carried if it had entered the water. This work required coordination between forensic specialists, marine experts, and law enforcement. Despite extensive efforts, the search initially yielded no immediate results. The absence of physical recovery created increasing pressure within the investigation. Without a body or direct evidence of what had occurred, the case relied heavily on reconstruction, inference, and the elimination of alternative explanations. As the investigation progressed, media attention intensified further. The case had now moved far beyond local coverage and had become a national story. Public interest brought both support and scrutiny. The image of a missing pregnant woman resonated widely, while questions surrounding her husband became a focal point of discussion across news outlets and public forums. This level of attention introduced additional complexity. Investigators had to ensure that the integrity of the case remained intact despite external speculation. Every new development was carefully managed to avoid influencing the direction of the investigation based on public pressure rather than evidence. Within the investigative team, discussions began to focus more heavily on motive and behavioral consistency. Scott's life before December 24 was examined in greater detail, including his routines, relationships, and communication patterns. Investigators were attempting to understand whether there were changes in behavior leading up to the disappearance that might provide context for later events. At the same time, inconsistencies in his statements continued to be reviewed. Small variations in his timeline, differences in how he described certain events, and gaps in verification all contributed to an increasingly detailed profile of uncertainty. Again, none of these elements alone were definitive, but together they formed a pattern that investigators could not ignore. One of the most critical aspects of this phase was the attempt to reconcile physical evidence with behavioral evidence. In many cases, physical findings provide a foundation that behavioral analysis helps interpret. In this case, the relationship between the two was more complicated, as physical evidence was limited and much of the interpretation relied on reconstruction. As pressure mounted, investigators also expanded their efforts to identify any potential external witnesses or overlooked leads. Surrounding areas were rechecked, and additional interviews were conducted. The goal was to ensure that no external explanation had been missed. However, these efforts did not produce alternative suspects or scenarios that could fully account for the known facts. By this point, the investigation had narrowed significantly in focus. While multiple theoretical possibilities had been considered early on, the accumulation of evidence and lack of external indicators gradually shifted attention inward. This shift did not represent a conclusion, but it did represent a directional change in investigative focus. Family members of Lacey remained deeply involved, continuing public appeals and participating in search coordination. Their presence added emotional weight to the investigation and reinforced the human dimension behind the procedural work being conducted. Despite the growing complexity of the case, the central concern remained unchanged: the location and fate of Lacey Peterson and her unborn son. As investigators moved further into analysis, they began constructing increasingly detailed timelines that combined all available data. These timelines integrated phone records, witness statements, environmental conditions, and behavioral observations into a unified sequence of events. The goal was to identify moments of certainty and uncertainty within the critical window of December 24. It was during this phase that investigators began to see more clearly how small gaps in information could have larger implications when viewed in sequence. A missing confirmation here, an unverified statement there, and subtle inconsistencies in timing began to create a structure that required careful interpretation. The investigation had now reached a stage where direct answers were still absent, but the framework for understanding what might have happened was becoming more defined. Each piece of evidence was no longer viewed in isolation, but as part of an interconnected system of information. And within that system, investigators continued searching for the moment where interpretation could finally become certainty, and where the fragmented events of a single December morning could be understood as a complete and coherent sequence. As the Scott Peterson case moved from investigation into courtroom proceedings, the entire narrative that had been built through months of searching, analyzing, and reconstructing began to face a new kind of pressure. In the courtroom, evidence is no longer just collected and interpreted in private. It is presented, challenged, and exposed to the structured adversarial system of law. Every detail that once existed in the investigative file was now subjected to scrutiny under rules of admissibility, relevance, and reasonable doubt. By the time the trial formally began in 2004, the disappearance of Lacey Peterson had already transformed into a homicide case involving both her and her unborn son, Connor. The charges reflected this shift, placing Scott Peterson at the center of a legal accusation that carried the most serious consequences in the justice system. The prosecution's argument was built on the idea that this was not a random disappearance, but a deliberate act driven by personal motivation and concealed through deception. The courtroom itself became a stage where two competing narratives unfolded. On one side, prosecutors worked to construct a cohesive story from circumstantial evidence, behavioral analysis, and reconstructed timelines. On the other side, the defense focused on challenging the reliability of that interpretation, emphasizing the absence of direct physical evidence linking Scott Peterson to the act of murder. The prosecution began by laying out a sequence of events centered around December 24, 2002. They described Scott's departure from the home, his fishing trip to the San Francisco Bay, and the timeline of Lacey's disappearance. Each element was presented not in isolation, but as part of a larger pattern of behavior that, according to their argument, suggested intent and premeditation. They emphasized inconsistencies in Scott's statements, highlighting variations in his timeline and differences between his early accounts and later explanations. The prosecution also introduced the relationship with Amber Fry as a critical component of motive, suggesting that Scott was seeking a new life separate from his marriage at the time of Lacey's disappearance. In addition to behavioral evidence, the prosecution presented forensic and environmental data related to the recovery of Lacey's body and the conditions in the San Francisco Bay. They argued that the location where her remains were found was consistent with the area Scott claimed to have been fishing, creating a geographical connection between his movements and the eventual discovery. Throughout their presentation, the prosecution's strategy relied heavily on building a narrative of coherence. They did not claim to have witnessed the crime directly, but instead argued that when all pieces were combined, the most reasonable explanation pointed toward guilt. The defense, however, approached the case from a fundamentally different perspective. Their argument centered on the principle that suspicion, no matter how strong, cannot replace direct evidence. They emphasized that no eyewitness had seen the alleged crime, no murder weapon had been recovered, and no definitive forensic evidence placed Scott Peterson at the scene of death. The defense also challenged the interpretation of behavioral evidence. They argued that inconsistencies in statements and emotional responses under stress could not be reliably used to determine guilt. According to their position, human behavior during traumatic events is often fragmented, influenced by shock, confusion, and external pressure. Regarding the affair with Amber Fry, the defense acknowledged its existence, but rejected the idea that it provided a clear motive for murder. They argued that while it may have reflected marital difficulties, it did not logically lead to the conclusion that Scott Peterson committed homicide. A significant portion of the defense strategy focused on alternative explanations for Lacey Peterson's disappearance. They suggested the possibility of an external abduction, or other unknown factors, that could account for the lack of direct evidence linking Scott to the crime. While they did not present a specific alternative suspect, their emphasis remained on the absence of conclusive proof. As the trial progressed, witnesses were called to testify from both sides. Investigators described their findings, forensic experts explained environmental and medical evidence, and individuals connected to Scott and Lacey provided personal observations about their relationship and behavior leading up to December 24. One of the most impactful aspects of the trial was the presentation of reconstructed timelines. These visual and verbal reconstructions attempted to map the events of that day in precise detail, breaking down hours into smaller segments, and aligning known data points with reported actions. These timelines became central to how the jury would eventually understand the sequence of events. Throughout the proceedings, the emotional weight of the case was visible in the courtroom. Family members of Lacey and Connor attended regularly, their presence underscoring the human cost behind the legal arguments. Their expressions and reactions became part of the broader emotional landscape of the trial, though the legal process itself remained focused on evidence and procedure. Media coverage of the trial was extensive. Every major development was reported and analyzed, often in real time. This created a parallel narrative outside the courtroom, where public opinion continued to form and evolve based on partial access to information. While the jury was instructed to focus solely on presented evidence, the broader cultural impact of the case was unavoidable. As closing arguments approached, both sides refined their positions. The prosecution reiterated their narrative of motive, opportunity, and behavioral inconsistency, emphasizing that when viewed collectively, the evidence pointed toward guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The defense returned to its central argument of evidentiary absence, insisting that the state had built a case on inference rather than proof. After weeks of testimony and presentation, the case was handed to the jury for deliberation. This marked a critical transition from argument to decision. Inside the jury room, all presented evidence had to be weighed collectively, without external influence, and evaluated against the legal standard required for conviction. The deliberation process itself was not public, but its significance was absolute. Every piece of testimony, every exhibit, and every argument presented in court was now subject to private evaluation by individuals tasked with reaching a unanimous verdict. When the verdict was finally reached in November 2004, the courtroom atmosphere reflected the culmination of months of legal and emotional tension. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder for the death of their unborn son, Connor. The sentencing phase followed, during which the court determined punishment based on the severity of the conviction. Scott Peterson was sentenced to death, a decision that reflected the jury's acceptance of the prosecution's narrative and the legal standards applied in the case. However, the story did not end there in a simple or final way. Years later, the case would undergo further legal review, and in 2020, the death sentence was overturned due to procedural issues related to jury selection. The conviction itself remained, but the penalty was modified to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The courtroom outcome solidified the case in legal terms, but it did not eliminate the broader questions that had surrounded it from the beginning. The absence of direct physical evidence, the reliance on circumstantial interpretation, and the psychological complexity of the narrative continued to fuel discussion long after the trial ended. Inside the justice system, the case was considered resolved according to legal standards. Outside of it, it remained a subject of analysis, debate, and interpretation. The courtroom had provided a conclusion, but not everyone agreed that it provided complete understanding. And so, even after the verdict was delivered, the case continued to exist in two parallel forms, one defined by law, and one defined by ongoing human uncertainty. After the verdict was read and the courtroom slowly emptied, a different kind of silence settled over the Scott Peterson case. It was not the tense silence of anticipation that had filled the trial, nor the hollow silence of a missing person mystery waiting for answers. This silence was heavier, shaped by finality in the legal sense, but not necessarily in the emotional or philosophical sense. The system had delivered its conclusion, but the deeper questions that surrounded the case did not disappear with the closing of courtroom doors. For the family of Laci Peterson, the aftermath was not about legal definitions or procedural outcomes. It was about loss that had already taken root long before the trial began. The verdict confirmed what prosecutors had argued, but it did not restore what had been taken. The absence that began on December 24, 2002, remained permanent. The presence of Laci and her unborn son, Connor, could not be reconstructed through evidence or argument. What remained instead were memories, fragments of a life that had been interrupted in a way that no legal decision could reverse. Grief, in cases like this, does not move in a straight line. It shifts, it deepens, and it often coexists with a need for understanding. For those closest to Laci, the trial may have provided a form of closure in terms of accountability, but closure itself is not a fixed state. It is something that changes over time, shaped by reflection, memory, and the ongoing process of living with what cannot be undone. Beyond the immediate family, the case left a lasting impression on the broader public. It had become one of the most widely followed criminal cases in the United States, not only because of its tragic nature, but because of the way it challenged common assumptions about evidence, behavior, and certainty. The absence of direct physical proof forced observers to confront the role of circumstantial evidence in the justice system, and how narratives are constructed from fragments rather than complete pictures. For some, the verdict represented a clear and necessary outcome, the result of careful analysis and logical inference based on the available evidence. For others, it raised concerns about the limits of interpretation, particularly when behavior and perception become central to determining guilt. These differing perspectives did not simply disappear after the trial. Instead, they became part of the ongoing legacy of the case, shaping how it would be discussed and understood in the years that followed. The role of media in shaping that legacy cannot be overlooked. From the early days of Lacey's disappearance to the final moments of the trial, coverage had been extensive and continuous. Television broadcasts, newspaper articles, and later documentaries all contributed to a narrative that extended far beyond the courtroom. In many ways, the case became a reflection of how modern society processes tragedy, where information is shared rapidly, opinions form quickly, and the line between reporting and interpretation can become blurred. This level of exposure brought both awareness and complication. On one hand, it ensured that the case remained visible, that Lacey's story was not forgotten, and that investigative efforts were supported by public attention. On the other hand, it introduced the risk of bias, where public perception could influence how evidence was viewed, even if unintentionally. The challenge of separating fact from narrative became part of the broader conversation surrounding the case. Within the legal system, the Scott Peterson case also contributed to ongoing discussions about the nature of circumstantial evidence. While such evidence is a recognized and valid component of criminal law, its interpretation requires careful consideration. The case demonstrated how multiple indirect pieces of information can be combined to form a compelling argument, but it also highlighted the importance of ensuring that each piece is evaluated objectively, without being influenced by assumptions or external pressure. The later modification of Scott Peterson's sentence in 2020 added another layer to the case's legacy. The decision to overturn the death penalty due to issues in jury selection did not alter the conviction itself, but it reinforced the idea that legal processes must remain precise and fair at every stage. Even in cases where outcomes appear definitive, procedural integrity remains essential to maintaining trust in the justice system. For those who study criminal behavior and investigative processes, the case offers a complex example of how evidence, psychology, and narrative intersect. It shows how human actions, when examined under scrutiny, can be interpreted in multiple ways, and how the absence of direct proof does not necessarily prevent the formation of a legal conclusion. At the same time, it serves as a reminder that certainty in such cases is often constructed rather than observed, built from patterns rather than singular moments of clarity. Beyond analysis and discussion, however, the core of the case remains deeply human. It is the story of a woman who was preparing to become a mother, of a life that was moving toward a future that never arrived. It is also the story of a family that was forced to navigate loss in a way that became public, their private grief unfolding under the attention of an entire nation. Time has a way of reshaping how events are remembered. As years pass, details may fade, but certain images remain. The image of Lacey Peterson, smiling and expectant, becomes a symbol not only of her individual life, but of the vulnerability that exists within ordinary moments. The image of a quiet suburban home becomes a reminder that tragedy does not always announce itself through obvious warning signs. In reflecting on the case, it becomes clear that its impact extends beyond its immediate circumstances. It raises questions about trust, about how well people truly know those closest to them, and about the hidden complexities that can exist beneath outward appearances. It also challenges assumptions about how truth is determined, and how justice is defined in situations where complete certainty may never be fully attainable. The Scott Peterson case does not offer simple answers. Instead, it presents a layered narrative where facts, interpretations, and emotions intersect in ways that resist easy resolution. The legal system reached its conclusion, and within that framework, the case is considered closed. Yet in a broader sense, it continues to exist as a subject of reflection, analysis, and ongoing discussion. And perhaps that is the most enduring aspect of the story. Not the verdict itself, but the questions that remain around it. Questions about what happened in the quiet hours of a December morning, about how ordinary life can shift without warning, and about how truth is understood when it must be assembled from pieces that never fully reveal the whole picture. Time did not erase the Scott Peterson case. Instead, it changed the way it was held in memory, shifting it from a breaking headline into something more reflective, more dissected, and in some ways, more unsettling. Years after the verdict, the story no longer unfolded in real time. It existed in fragments, court transcripts, interviews, documentaries, and quiet personal recollections carried by those who had lived through it. And in that distance, the case began to take on a different shape, one less driven by urgency and more by contemplation. In the years following the trial, public conversation did not fade as quickly as it often does with other cases. Instead, it lingered. People revisited the evidence, re-examined the timeline, and questioned the conclusions with a kind of slow, persistent curiosity. It became a case that lived not only in legal records, but in the collective imagination, where uncertainty has a way of taking root and growing over time. Part of this enduring attention came from the nature of the evidence itself. The case had always rested heavily on circumstantial connections, on patterns rather than direct observation. For some, this made the verdict feel logical, even inevitable when viewed as a whole. For others, it left space for doubt, not necessarily about the outcome, but about the completeness of the explanation. The absence of a clear, visible moment, the exact sequence of actions that led to Laci Peterson's death, remained an unfilled space in the narrative. This gap allowed the case to evolve into something more than a concluded trial. It became a subject of analysis, of reinterpretation, and in some instances, of disagreement. Documentaries and long-form investigations revisited the story, often presenting the same evidence from slightly different angles. Interviews with investigators, attorneys, and commentators added layers of perspective, each attempting to frame the events in a way that made sense within their understanding of the case. For the family of Laci Peterson, however, the passage of time did not transform the core reality of what had happened. Loss does not become abstract simply because years pass. It becomes quieter, perhaps less visible to the outside world, but it remains present in everyday life. Milestones that should have existed, birthdays, school years, family gatherings with a growing child, were replaced by their absence. Time, in this sense, did not heal so much as it reshaped the way grief was carried. Scott Peterson's life, confined within the prison system, also continued in a different kind of suspended state. His conviction remained, even as the legal process revisited aspects of his sentencing. The 2020 decision to overturn the death penalty introduced a renewed moment of public attention, not because it altered the core verdict, but because it reminded people that legal conclusions are not always as final as they seem. Even years after a case appears resolved, elements of it can return to scrutiny, reopening discussions that had settled into the background. Within the legal community, the case continued to serve as a reference point in discussions about circumstantial evidence and jury perception. It illustrated how a collection of indirect elements can form a persuasive argument, but also how such arguments depend heavily on interpretation. The balance between inference and proof became one of the central lessons drawn from the case, shaping how similar cases would be approached in the future. Beyond the courtroom, the case also influenced public awareness of missing persons investigations. It highlighted how quickly a disappearance can escalate into a national concern, and how media coverage can shape both the direction of an investigation and the perception of those involved. The image of Laci Peterson remained a powerful symbol, representing not only her individual story, but the broader vulnerability of lives that can change without warning. There was also a psychological dimension to the case that continued to draw attention. Observers often return to the question of behavior, examining how individuals respond under stress, how emotions are expressed or withheld, and how those expressions are interpreted by others. The case became an example of how behavior can be read in multiple ways, and how those readings can influence judgments even when they are not definitive. In quiet moments, away from analysis and debate, the story of Laci Peterson returns to something much simpler and more personal. It is the story of a woman who woke up on a December morning expecting to continue her life, as it had been unfolding, unaware that the day would mark its end. It is the story of a child who never had the chance to exist beyond expectation, whose presence was known only through anticipation and loss. The home on Covina Avenue, once filled with plans and preparation, became part of that memory. It stood as a physical reminder that ordinary spaces can hold extraordinary events, even when nothing about them appears unusual at first glance. Over time, the house changed ownership, its interior reshaped by new lives, but its place in the narrative of the case remained fixed. For those who study true crime, the Peterson case often represents a turning point in how stories are told and consumed. It marked a moment when media coverage, legal process, and public fascination intersected in a way that created a lasting cultural imprint. It demonstrated how a single case can move beyond its immediate circumstances to become part of a larger conversation about truth, justice, and human behavior. Yet even with all this analysis, all the discussion, and all the revisiting of facts, there remains something unresolved at the center of the story. Not in a legal sense, where the system has already delivered its conclusion, but in a human sense, where understanding is often more complex than verdicts can capture. The exact sequence of events that led to Laci Peterson's death is still reconstructed rather than witnessed, inferred rather than directly observed. This lingering uncertainty is part of what keeps the case alive in memory. It invites reflection, not because it lacks answers entirely, but because the answers it provides are built from interpretation. It challenges the idea that truth is always clear, and instead suggests that in some cases, truth is something that must be assembled, carefully and imperfectly, from what remains. And so the story continues, not as an unfolding investigation, but as a fixed moment in time that people return to, again and again, searching for clarity within complexity. It remains a reminder that even in cases where justice has been served according to the law, the deeper questions about what happened, why it happened, and how it could happen at all do not always find complete resolution. In the end, the Scott Peterson case exists in two forms. One is the official record, defined by evidence, argument, and verdict. The other is the memory of a life interrupted, carried forward by those who remember not the case, but the person at its center. And between those two forms lies the space where reflection continues, long after the headlines have faded.